This week we're going to be having a quick look at some basics of colour theory. This applies to so many areas: web design, interior design, just putting clothes together, cooking, making food look appealing, anything that requires colour, which is so much. Every area of creativity. Colour at its most basic is just a ground coloured pigment, like this fabulous pigment, cadmium red from Zecchi's, that amazing art shop in Florence. If I add a bit of oil, you've got oil paint, and it is the basis for all other paints as well. When it is in this pure form, and it's such a pure colour, no white has been added to it yet, it is completely transparent. The minute you add any white, it goes opaque, and you end up with, well, here, a very pale pink. Pure colour obviously has a very strong tinting capacity, whereas premixed colours, let's say Naples yellow, have a very weak tinting capacity. So I've chosen to use Viridian green and Quidacrone red. These are both fairly opposite ends of the spectrum. Really, really strong, vibrant colours, very high in their chroma. And when you add a bit of white, you can see a tiny bit as a very, very strong tinting characteristic. I'm also going to be mixing up a couple of more values. So we'll start with a very light, very, very pale, slightly tinted green. I'll go for a sort of more medium value. This is the one in the middle. And then I'll also mix up a much stronger value. And this is really important to have a variety of values in your paintings. And it's much easier if you mix these up before. I'm using a grey palette. These are fantastic, these disposable palettes, for various reasons. They're from New Wave. I'm not great at remembering to clean my palette, and it's really annoying starting with a filthy palette in the morning and having to scrape it all back and start again. So actually, if I've forgotten to clean it off, I just chuck these out and start again. You should never really reuse your oil paint that much. It kind of condenses, or it sort of goes sticky overnight, and you don't have the same flow and characteristics as you did the day before. So learning to balance your values is so important when you're putting any sort of colour scheme together, whether it's choosing cushions for your sofa, choosing colours to put together to wear, making food look attractive. Understanding how to balance the values is really crucial in the success of any project. I can see my two light values and my two medium values are actually pretty well matched. It's also important as an artist to understand your sort of tinting strength of your colours. The two colours I've chosen are incredibly strong because they're a very pure pigment, a very strong chroma. So when they come out of the tube, there's no white mixed in with them. They're pure pigment. So that's why we need so little to make up these values. I'm going to use a little bit of glaze medium, and I love this Robertson's glaze medium. It's very quick drying, which I like for my work. It really suits the speed at which I work. It's pretty good value and is the one I tend to always go to. As we can see, the pigment is completely transparent with the glaze, but even the tiniest bit of white will make it opaque. So now I'm going to mix up a third value. So now I've got a good variety across the spectrum from light through to dark, and I can use these throughout my paintings. And if I stick to this range, I know my painting will be fairly harmonious. The other thing I'm going to be able to do is mix the two colours, the green and the red, together to neutralise their colour, and then I'll have really good range of neutrals. And if I stick with light, medium with medium, and a darker one with a darker, I know my neutrals will balance really well too. There's also a really clever way to check your values if you're struggling to see it by eye, and that's to take your mobile phone, to take a photo of it, and then turn it to grayscale, and then without the distraction of the colour, you can see whether your values balance. And your values is just the strength of the colour on the grayscale. So let's give this a go. We'll take a photo, go to the edit section, and choose the mono. You want mono rather than the other black and white ones thing. And then I can see on my darkest one, the green value is much lighter than the pink. It's much harder to see with the naked eye, but if I add a bit more green, then it will hopefully balance a bit better with the pink. And then now those two are the same value range, and you can use this on anything. If you're trying to choose cushions for a sofa and you can't figure out why, despite the fact they're from the same colour range, they don't really go, often it's because you've got the values wrong, and one is either too pale or too strong, and together they just don't fit, even though they're both green, for example. And equally, if you're trying to choose an opposing colour, say, I'm just using the sofa as an example, pink cushions on a green sofa. If your sofa and pink cushions are actually a very similar value, sometimes that doesn't have as impactful an effect as if you've got a very pale sofa and a much stronger value of colour pink on the cushion. I hope that makes sense, but it can be applied to anything. For example, any sort of design, web design, card design. You really want to look at balancing your colours and having a look at it in monochrome before you choose your final colours, because it's such an easy way to see if the design itself balances without the destruction of colour. So for me, this little colour study is the precursor to a big original painting, and I'll put a couple of older examples up now so you can see what these lead to. It's so important to do these colour studies and get your values right. For the background, I'm going to use the green, and I know this is going to contrast really well to the pink because it's pretty much dead opposite on the colour spectrum. It's going to make the pink really pop out, and because I've tested my values, I know they'll work well together. My next step is to mix some neutrals, so by taking a little bit from both ranges of colour, I can create a very neutral colour. I've completely killed the red and green and created a fairly sort of neutral grey-purple. By sticking within the same value ranges, I know these neutrals will work with the colour combinations that I've got, and it just makes it a lot simpler to make your painting balance. The neutrals make very good shadows because they're cool in contrast to the pink, so that's what I'm going to use on the body of the flamingo to create shadow colours. I'm then going to use some of the darker values on the points that are the furthest from the light. So if we think of the light coming from the top right hand corner, obviously the coolest and darkest areas are going to be the points that are the furthest from that light source, and the warmest areas are going to be the areas nearest it. So I'm adding in the dark bits onto the flamingo. If I want to create a really dark, I can mix the two colours in their strongest form to create almost a black. It's quite incredible when you start mixing it together. And actually, I never have black on my palette anymore because I just tend to mix the colours in their purest form. If I added a little bit of yellow to this, it would actually kill the chroma even further. So back to the flamingo. I'm just filling in the details here, and then I'm actually going to go back in and check my values and start adding the lightest values. So obviously, as we get nearer to the light source, it's going to be the lightest and warmest colour we have on our palette, and that is our pale pink. Because obviously things that are tinted with pink are warm, that is tinted with the green is going to be cold. The next stage is to make my flamingo stand out on the page a bit more, and I do this by adding a darker value next to the lightest value, making him pop out of the background. Now I'm going to add some of that very intense high chroma pink, that really vivid hue. I'm only going to add this onto the subject because that's where I want the viewer's eye to be drawn. I'm not going to add any equivalent hue in green because it would fight with the subject itself. Now we're on to the final flourishes, the final touches of this painting. I'm adding some reflected light, and I'm using the pale green because reflected light is cool. It comes from the water, and whereas light that is reflecting from the sun will be warm. Back to that very intense pink, and I'm just adding a couple more details. Then I'm going to add some along the edges that turn away from the viewer's eye, and this slightly delineates it between the values of the pink and the green, but it also turns that edge with a slightly darker hue. The final touches on this little colour study are to add the highlights, your brightest brights, and then also to add your darkest darks on your subject matter. And I think it's been quite a successful little painting and a precursor to a bigger one, hopefully. I really hope you've enjoyed this week and can apply some of the principles to whatever your creative practice is. Thank you very much and see you next Monday.